Elle Jones, so good to have you here on the launch of our book club. I know that we were scheduled before. Life happens in politics, as you know, and so I'm glad that we can finally meet. I started this book club. It's going to be happening hopefully once a month going forward, just highlighting rad books that provide perspective from an intersectional feminist perspective, and of course happened upon your book, The Queen Intersectional Feminist, where I've had the pleasure of being on many panels with. Abolitionist Intimacies, brilliant book. Power. It's everything you write and how you write it. You just blow my mind up, your power. But, I just wanted, because we have a wide audience, Abolitionist Intimacies, why did you write it?
Yeah, so don't let the title put you off, first of all. I feel like sometimes people see these big words in the title and I don't know if this is for me. But it really just means freedom and love. And that's really what the book is about. So it's a large part testimony about the conditions, particularly in Canadian prisons, but also facing anybody experiencing state violence, whether from our deportation system, our police, and particularly inside prisons. It's part memoir, so it's a lot of really an account of about 10 years on the front lines of particularly Black women and Indigenous women and other women fighting these issues in Canada. It's got poetry. So it's really 10 years of my life poured into a book that is part witness, part love letter, part documenting of the work that we do. And what it's really about is just, this work together of fighting against the bars, fighting beyond punishment, fighting for different solutions, and really looking towards a society that's built on mutual care, collective action, and love.
So what is abolitionism? Like, what is it? What does it mean to be an abolitionist? Because people hear that word and it's like an explosion of radical ideas. But what is it? What is being an abolitionist?
So abolitionism, as we use it, was really coined in 1996 by Black feminists. And it was deliberately named to echo the movement against slavery. So that's where people are often very familiar with the word abolitionism, the abolition of slavery. And it was deliberately chosen because, of course, there are now more Black people under penal control in the United States than there were under enslavement. So it's to recognize the continuation between slavery and now the state uses prisons, punishment, police, to incarcerate people. This is, of course, really similar in Canada, not only through Black people, which we think only exists in the States, but of course with Indigenous people as well. So many people have called prisons the new residential schools. So abolition is recognizing that historical sweep that, we used to use the RCMP to track Indigenous kids down and stick them in residential schools and torture and institutionalize them. Now 50% of federally incarcerated women are Indigenous women, so we can see the connection. So that's really where it's from. And it was really recognizing that this state that's based on punishment, that's based on policing, doesn't work, that this is an oppressive system, and that we can have better solutions than using prison and punishment to address our social problems. So
like what, Al?
Well, the first question people ask is what about murders? But, if you think about, first of all, right now on remand, so people who haven't even been convicted of any crime, we're now 80% of our federal jails are people who haven't even been convicted yet and are just sitting in jail because they can't get bail, largely poor people, Indigenous people, Black people, people without status. If you think about the fact that we criminalize homelessness in this country. So somebody's camping in your neighborhood because they don't have a home, so you call the police, and we saw that across this country, like the clearing of tents. When we think about the fact that we criminalize poverty in this country. So incarceration of women has really exploded with austerity. So the more that we've seen social cuts to social services or to income assistance, we've seen a rise of incarcerated women. And our rates have been going up and up, particularly Indigenous women. So we know that we criminalize being poor, being mentally ill. 50% of women who are incarcerated have a disability. So we're still criminalizing being disabled. And of course, people who don't have access to resources get different sentences and more punishment than other people. So corporations, of course, kill all kinds of people. like the environment itself, that's a crime, like that is killing communities, that is killing our planet. Those people aren't in prison. We know who the 100 most polluters are that are damaging our planet. They're not in prison. Nobody went to prison during the global recession and crash where they stole everybody's money and embezzled, trillions of dollars. Like, they didn't go to prison. But if you steal baby formula from the Walmart, then you're going to prison. So we have to recognize that the way we think of crime is uneven. We think of street crime and we criminalize those petty crimes. We criminalize being mentally ill. We criminalize drug use. We criminalize homelessness. And then the things that are actually harmful, we don't actually punish. So prison doesn't punish bad people. It's not like all bad people are in prison. In fact, many bad people never get punished, and many people who have experienced trauma and poverty and mental health issues, that's what we're using prisons for. So abolition is about recognizing that and looking for other solutions that cost less. So it costs $250,000 to $300,000 to keep a woman in prison for a year, where you could be housing her, giving her mental health care, helping her find a job, helping her parent. And instead of doing that, we're incarcerating those women. And so
250
justice. Yeah, go ahead.
50,000, 300,000 a year. I've been fighting for something, a guaranteed livable basic income, but we'll talk about that later. Mm. But I wrote something years ago. I did a speech and I called prisons the dumping ground for all the colonial trauma that nobody wants to deal with. You talk a lot about that in your book. You talk a lot about the connection between incarceration and colonization. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, so
I just love the way you do it. You wrote a poem too. I'm going to find it.
Often here, what we call in Canada public safety, right? We have an Office of Public Safety, and that's under that is immigration, so CBSA, like not immigration like the immigration minister, but like deportation. So CBSA, that's in the name of public safety, Canadian Border Services. Obviously, like parole and stuff is under that. So Minister of Public Safety. And what we use to mean safety is, of course, policing crime. And so if you think about when we say public safety, who do we mean by the public? We don't mean Indigenous people. We don't mean queer and trans people who use drugs, sex workers, people living in poverty, people who have disabilities. These are all people. We're not considered part of the public. And so the safety of the public has always been about having that thin blue line to police like the gated white community from us. So we've always been outside of the public, and discipline and control measures have always been used against us, whether that's the reserve system, whether that's enslavement and segregation, which existed in Canada. That's not something that only existed in the US. I live in Nova Scotia. We had segregated schooling well into the 1950s, and the last school closed in 1983. We have segregated graveyards. So, the idea that none of this existed in the U.S., slavery existed in Canada longer than the abolition of slavery has existed. And we know that all of those were ways of controlling the population. So moving Indigenous people onto reserves, so you could steal the land, commit genocide, and then control the population. South Africa's apartheid was based upon Indigenous reserves and coming and literally being like, oh, you make these people have papers? Like, we'll make our people have papers.
Yeah, and that people don't know that, Al.
Yeah, I know.
A lot of people don't know that fast fact that the apartheid system in South Africa was actually based off what happened in Canada with the reserve system in terms of papers and Indian Act and all of that. Yeah.
It used to be illegal for an Indigenous person to be caught drinking off a reserve like well into 1970s. So all of these things are ways of controlling populations, and that's what colonialism has always done. Moved us off the land, stolen and appropriated our labor, stolen our resources, and then said that we're a threat and that we need to be controlled. And if we're not controlled, we'll break free and like rape white women, which is always a myth about Black criminality, or we'll steal from you, or we'll be drunken, or, all of these myths around our criminality, our inferior intellect, our savagery, all of those things. And so in the present day, prison has really come to be the dumping ground, as you say, for all of those undesirables that are outside of the idea of public safety. So we have to ask ourselves, when somebody's asking for change outside Tim Hortons, why do we think the police is the response to that and not making sure they have a bed and food? When somebody's living in a tent, why are the police the response to that? When somebody's having a mental health crisis, why are we calling the police? Why have we learned to rely on this policing system costing us, millions, hundreds of millions, billions of dollars when you add in all the forms of policing in Canada to no effect, instead of funding things that exist in our communities that actually help people? So we can see this long-standing connection of controlling populations, labeling people as inferior, and then saying they're a danger to the public, and safety depends on us being somewhere else. So wherever that is, on the reserve, in the prison, in the youth jail, out across the border, back in your own country. And so this is what we see taking place. So that's actually, to get to the title of the book, I call those things carceral intimacies. So the idea that this system always uses closeness against us. So they're in our phones surveying us. They'll strip search you. They control the kind of intimacy we have. Social workers will come into your home and look in your fridge. They will take your baby off your breast at the hospital. So this idea of like abusing intimacy to police us and damage us and take us from ourselves. And as opposed to that is what I'm calling our abolitionist intimacies. So those are all the ways that we find amongst ourselves to build a different system. So whether that was like when women in Winnipeg started going to the hospital to block people from taking babies with birth alerts, that's an act of abolitionist intimacy, of the deep love and care and responsive community. When we pack prison boxes for the people who have been sent away, when we make sure there's money on the phones, when we go to visits and touch people, when we see through the bars together, when we stop the deportation, when we fight for the bodies of people to not be left in a garbage dump. These are all acts that we take that work against the power of the state that it has to dehumanize us and to control us and criminalize us and label us as subhuman. And we're not. So
I have a question. Okay. I mean, you're brilliant, Al. I'm a big fan of your work, just, and your thinking and your ability to deconstruct, right? And where does that come from? I want to know a little bit about you. Why do you care? People often ask me, why do I care? And a lot of it for me is connected to my family, my roots, my history. So since I'm highlighting you, I want to know a little bit about you, Al. Where do you come? What makes you tick? What made Al go from, I have a thought to blowing up the universe with intellectual genius? So I want to know a little bit about you. Tell me a little bit about yourself.
I actually talk about it in the opening of the book. So my mother's family is from Trinidad, which was a colonized country in her lifetime. Her father, my grandfather, who was quite a bit older than my grandmother, so I never met him. He died in the 1960s, but he was a very, very political figure, including being a calypso singer, so a political singer. So in other words, he did basically the work in song that I did in poetry. He was a trade unionist. He was actually a brilliant man, but obviously was denied a degree, so was making fireworks in Trinidad. And he was also an oral historian of calypso and Trinidad history. And so those stories and my other family stories from my mother was big on our family history. So she wasn't a race person, she wouldn't put it in terms of race, but she would always tell these stories about, your granddaddy did this. My aunt was actually the first Black woman to integrate the convent school. So she always told us these stories. And she told them in terms of triumph, we could triumph over these things and get an education, But then as you get older, you really start putting the pieces together. Well, why was the school segregated? Well, why couldn't my grandfather work? What do you mean Black girls can go to the school? So really through those stories, I was building this history. And then obviously with this towering political figure. And then at the same time, my grandmother was a very saintly woman. So she left her door open and people would steal from her and she'd say, well, they must need it, So she was a very, very generous, loving, spiritual, caring woman. So I think that side, so the fire side is from my grandfather, and then the side of community responsibility and care really came through the maternal line in my family. We're a matriarchy in my family. Until very recently, we only had one boy a generation. So we were just women. And the way that people succeeded was women supporting other women. So when my mom, for example, had to leave home at age 15 to go study in the UK because she wanted to study science, and they didn't have that in Trinidad for girls. Yeah. Her sisters would be working as domestics, working as nannies, people that were working in New York away as domestics, and sending, $20 and being go get yourself food, go to a play, go get yourself a winter coat. My mom wasn't spending that money. And then one of her sisters was oh, I wish I could go to school and be a teacher. My mom said, well, I have the money, and send it right back. And this is how people survived. The woman who had to go work away from their own families as domestics and would be sending the Christmas box. So there was always this very feminist network of woman support in my family. And so that, So that whole history, as you said, I think it's really knowing what you owe those from the past and really understanding like what we came out of. My sister as well, my sister Zilla, who's like in your writing.
I know I'm going to be talking to Zilla. She doesn't know yet, but I will be.
Yeah. So, she's a little bit older than me. I used to sneak into her room and steal her books. So she started reading Black books. So that really influenced me as well. I stole a lot of books from her room and I was like, and then like reading poetry as well. I talk about reading Ballad of Reading Gaol by Oscar Wilde and really understanding the injustice of prisons and really having my mind open to social justice. So really a combination of family and then like, really as I read and open to the world, like really being able to put those colonial pieces together with what I saw around me.
So beautiful story. I know you speak about some of it in your book. You also tell a lot of stories about relationships you make with incarcerated persons. Is there one that kind of sticks out? I mean, you wrote about one in your book, but is there a reason why you felt a need to share that story? Like, why did you share those stories? They're very touching stories.
It's interesting because, I wrote the first draft of this book, which used to be called Canada is So Polite. That was the first draft. And it...
Okay. Got to hear this.
And that's one of the poems.
Now I'm gonna be putting you on the spot.
Yeah, I can do the poem. So it lasts as a poem in the book, but originally the whole book was called that, and about a third of what's in this book was maybe in that book, but there was different stuff. But when I was in Banff, I actually wrote the first draft. And you have readings, and I realized, as everybody else read, that I never describe people visually in my book. Like, I never tell you what people look like, and almost every time I talk about people, it's something that they've said. It's all based on oral. And I realized, well, of course, because I'm taking phone calls all the time. These are calls from prison, and I've never seen anybody. And like they can sometimes see me on TV or whatever, but I don't know what people look like. And we've had like a 10-year relationship where we've fought together, we've organized together, we've had extremely deep emotional moments. We deeply love each other, and we've never met face to face. And so I think a lot of this book is testimony. It's just, how do you not, as people tell you these stories, how do you not try to witness it in some way? So there's just voices through this book. So you get a lot of voices from the front lines. And part of what I did want to show is what we go through organizing, like what is the actual work of organizing and the deep love and bonds, but the deep labor there. And then also, the deep love that exists behind bars as well, like when we undertake this work. So one of the stories I talk about throughout the book and really trace, and it's not done yet, is the story of Randy Riley, who is a wrongfully convicted African Nova Scotian man. In his case, they have no forensic evidence. Somebody else has confessed to the crime. The one witness they had has retracted and said, I lied, I was pressured to. Yeah. So, and this young man is still going through this as a Black African Nova Scotian man. So this is one of the stories I tell. Where else? Nobody else witnessed that. The media literally did not sit in court while we watched this man being incarcerated and is still fighting for his life. So much of this book is just testimony and story with permission from people, just so that we can understand, what is actually going on behind bars in this country. So if anybody's under the delusion that people get the help they need in there, or it's not like the United States, or, it's too soft in there, I really urge you to just read this book and understand the conditions, from the outrageously disgusting to the everyday dehumanization that exists daily behind bars, and people have no idea.
So a lot of people don't know this about me, Elle, but I took training. It's called Walls to Bridges, to train on how to teach university courses on the inside with folks on the outside, and they would take courses together. And when I was taking this training, and it was at the women's prison in not Kingston, Kitchener. Yeah. The women's prison in Kitchener, and we were sitting in a circle, and nobody knew who was on the inside and outside. And we're sitting in a circle, and it was very emotional. It was very emotional, and it was very powerful to have women sitting with women as human beings without labels. And then in the middle of the circle, it was disrupted. One of the rules of this training was nobody was allowed to divulge whether they were on the inside or outside. We just sat in a circle as human beings. But one of the guards came in, and they said, "Inmates, stand up." And I remember that. it was a moment where I saw women standing, totally stripped of identity, totally stripped of dignity, and dehumanized. And my first thought was, well, first, I felt a great sorrow for women that had become sisters in this training. But I thought, how can you support pro-social, because we talk about, antisocial behavior. How can you support pro-social behavior in a completely antisocial, violent environment? And it became very clear to me there. The difference was I got to leave and commiserate about my feelings. And I thought, I wonder how they felt having to stay there on the inside, having to deal with that day to day. I share that story because in your book, you do such a brilliant job humanizing people who have been incarcerated. You tell stories in a way that allow the reader to see humanity, because there's a process of dehumanization that I often find when we talk about, people that have been incarcerated or had involvement in the justice system. Was that intentional?
Yeah, I really, really wanted the writing to be as beautiful as possible. So it's all some kind of interesting because my poetry writing is like so straight ahead. Like my spoken word is very like, let's light a fire from the stage. And my prose writing is actually very lyrical, but that was on purpose because I really wanted the writing to do justice to people and really tell. And a lot of these stories, one of the things I realized is some of the images and stories come back in multiple places. And I didn't realize that until they were all together. So I'd talk about an image or something in a poem, and then I would have talked about it in a piece of journalism and then maybe in an essay. And so the same image or story might come up 3 or 4 times. I realized these things were haunting me. And I didn't think of how often I might have been using that same image or story. So trying to do justice somehow, if you've ever interacted in that story you tell is just so true to how prisons are. When we think about, like when I got kicked out of Nova Institution, a male guard was raping women at the same time as they were kicking me out because I hugged women after writing group. And I asked a woman about her day, and you're not allowed to do that. You're not allowed to say, oh, when you get out, give me a phone call. Those are things that are all seen as threatening and dangerous and security risks. Meanwhile, you have extremely high rates of sexual assault that take place inside prisons because they have male guards. And this actually happened in this prison. So it's such a irrational place, and it's very hard. Like when you're on the outside, if something goes wrong, you pick up the phone, you make a call, and like you flex your title. This is Dr. L. Jones, and and like usually there's a response like, hey, this is a mistake, like this thing happened. You can't do that in a prison. If you show up for visit and somehow your name isn't on the list, you're not arguing your way in. They're going to send you home, and it doesn't matter if it's an 8-hour drive. If you hit on the scanner because of road salt or sage and stuff that has happened to like elders, and offer like, I will let you strip search me so I can go in to see my child, it doesn't matter. Like so it's different universe where the truth and the right and like what you think should happen, they just don't exist in the same way. People try to have their injustices heard, and because they're a criminal, they're not believed. I'm sure if people in Parliament watch you talking to me about this, they may be very offended. Oh, how dare you say that about our prison system? It's just CSC is offended, and are there good people that do their best and work with the system? Absolutely. But is the system itself completely dysfunctional and inhumane? Yes. Right now, we're deeply understaffed, and we have people that are being held in solitary confinement conditions across prisons, not because they did anything, but simply there's not enough staff to open the doors and make sure that people get in the yard and get showers and get to speak to their lawyers. And that's just a really common condition. So I think that I really wanted to, both in rage and in love, to show those conditions, and also to really show the alternate to that. So like, who are these people that we talk about? When we talk about criminals, when we talk about the bad people in prison, when we just, imagine this place from watching TV or from, just what we don't know because you don't know much about prison, I just wanted there to be something really behind that. Now, that doesn't mean that harm doesn't occur. It doesn't mean I haven't experienced violence and harm. I have. I'm a Black woman, like I know that harm is serious, and people who do this work don't do it because we're naive to harm. It's not that we're like, oh, I just think you give everybody hugs and then the world gets better. That's how people portray it. It's not. We know that this hasn't worked. Black women are among the most abused women in the world, like us, along with Indigenous women. But we know that policing hasn't done anything to take violence out of our homes and communities. It hasn't got us seen as more human. It hasn't got our rapes prosecuted. It hasn't got our children that are seen as so adult when they're 12 years old and being raped by their social workers. This has happened to women I worked with. It hasn't done any of that. So why do we continue to invest in this system that doesn't solve any of these problems, doesn't bring us closure, doesn't bring us healing, and doesn't actually transform or intervene in anything?
So I want to build on that. So I'm a big supporter of you want crime prevention, affordable, accessible housing with rent geared to income, guaranteed livable basic income, right? Mental health support, free pharmacare, free mental health supports, free tuition. Like, we want to see transformative change in terms of investing in systems, because people often talk about that. We need to reinvest our money, investing in community centers, investing in libraries, Is that part of abolition? Is that part of the concept of abolition?
That's the whole concept, really. So obviously, as my friend Rachel Zeller says, like, if aliens came down and like blasted all the prisons, say, we ain't ready, we don't know what to do. Like, we don't know how. I often say this: we can't even get rapists out of our own friend circles, so we don't know how to deal with harm, and we need to learn. But we need to learn, like, that's why we need to stop relying on these systems and actually learn to build in our communities, to whether that's building sustainable food together and learning to tend the land and soil and work together with generations. We have to learn to engage in conflict productively. We have to teach our children how to recognize their emotions and how to solve conflict. And then we have to address these social harms. Do you think anybody's born and thinks, what I really want to do is I want to get into a life of crime? Like, that's not what happens. The vast majority of people, we know for women that over 90+% of women are victims of sexual and physical assault. I've personally never met an incarcerated woman that doesn't have a background of trauma. And that is true for the men as well. We don't talk about it as much, but that's very, very true. And often the men have been abused within institutions, like within youth care or within the youth justice system as well. So we know that, we talk about justice for rape victims, and we have all these victims of sexual assault, domestic violence, and incest in prison, and now suddenly they're bad people and they don't deserve any care. So we know that when we interrupt trauma, that we also interrupt harm. We know that, like, when people have resources to have a safe home, when people have enough food, when you have young children that see their mother can't eat and they're 12, 13 years old, well, what can I do? Well, okay, I'll sell something, we see these patterns. It's not that child is choosing that they're trying to save their family. So we know that most crime is crimes of poverty. And then, of course, mental health, the lack of treatment, the lack of good resources for people with addictions, the lack of interventions until very, very late. Many people will talk about having a loved one, particularly a young person. They understand there's a mental health struggle. They call for help and they're told we can't do anything until they are convicted of a crime. So we don't have any systems in place or like that people can access until after. And then once they're in prison, well, there's barely any programming. Then we talk about, why don't you get help in prison? So we can do that work before we get to prison.
100%.
Yeah.
So we're coming to the end.
I keep trying to sit up straight.
I know I could talk for 550 years. Like, we're coming to the end, though, and I cannot, in good conscience, have you on and not do a spoken word, because you just blow my mind with your spoken word poetry. And I had a request, and now I just want you to do it. I want you to pick a spoken word that you think is fitting, that kind of fits with our discussion. I know that you spoke at a women's march, and I was like, holy Dinah, you made my universe. I wanted you to share that one. But if there's another one that you wanted to share.
Which one did you want?
It was at a women's march. It's on a video. I was trolling on all your spoken word. I was showing a friend. I said, you've never heard Elle Jones? Oh my goodness. And then I started listening. I showed her, and then I indulged in a couple of other spoken words because I just love your spoken.
I think it was still we still rise. Was it that
yes.
one? Okay.
Oh yes. Oh my.
All right.
Oh my. Okay. Okay. Holding my breath.
We are the seat at the table. We descend from Sojourner Truth and Anne of Green Gables. We are Idle No More and Angela Davis. We are the grandmothers and the differently able. We are the hair that refuses to be tamed. We are honoring treaties and land claims. We are the movements that history never names. We are the waitresses and maids, the ponytails and braids, the queer woman in Black Lives Matter holding up your parade. We are the femmes who refuse to be shamed. We are the Mohawk woman calling the warriors to the barricades. We are lemonade. We are equal work for equal pay. From homemakers to women stitching clothes for $1 a day, we are Harriet Tubman toting that shotgun when the men got too afraid. We are the heartbeat of the nation. We are most of the nurses and the educators. We are the women in prison raising their babies. We've been advised to be patient, and we're tired of waiting. We are the anarchists and the peacemakers. We have been trained for resistance. We gain strength from walking with our sisters. We go to work and keep the house in visitor conditions. Unlike Charlie Sheen, we are actually winning. We are the anti-nuclear movement and abolition. We are the bosses called bitches for our ambition. We are plumbers, welders, and electricians. We run the whole office and are called the assistants. We can make a can of soup stretch to feed a whole family for dinner. We are grandmothers canning food for the winter. We are women's work like quilting and knitting, so you better believe we will make it through with wisdom like Athena. We are the grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo in Argentina, Latinas, Desis, and Filipinas. We are the love between Gabrielle and Zena. With power in our arms like Serena, we wear whatever the hell we want, from hijabs to bikinis. We are the nannies and the cleaners, the peasants and the Zapatistas. We have survived the patrols at the border, the backroom abortions, the guards and the wardens. We march against war for the mothers and orphans. We are the Guatemalan woman surviving torture. We are the indigenous woman fighting for clean water, the trans woman resisting the bathroom laws. We are the Jane Does in the missing person reports. We lead the peace movements for a better world for our daughters. We are the authors who had to take the names of men. We are feminist movements from Mexico to Uganda to Phnom Penh. We are the hashtag I Believe Woman. We are sex workers unionizing. We are the queens and trans women at Stonewall fighting. The women in Saudi Arabia driving. We are the girls resisting sexist advertising. We are more than Photoshop or vanity sizing. We are the indigenous women who push for an inquiry. We are Queen Nzinga protecting her country from the colonizer. We are the environmental activists who chain themselves to bulldozers, the civil rights activists facing the fire hoses, the tenancy boards challenging public housing eviction notices, the women prisoners in Kingston when the men cut off their clothes. We are hunger strikes in prisons for women's votes and the force-feeding tubes shoved down their throats. We are the teen girls challenging sexist dress codes. We are the 92-year-old woman walking during the Montgomery bus boycotts, the hidden figures behind the astronauts, the sewing machines and the pans and pots. We are suffragettes and sans-culottes. We are the mothers of Trayvon Martin, Mike Brown, and Eric Garner. We are karma, and we have millennia of survival as our armor. We are Tina Turner, finally leaving Ike, and we burn bright with the fires of Joan of Arc and the strength of thousands of martyrs. We have justice as our target. We are calls for an end for poverty and for affordable housing, reproductive rights and every life counting, respect for Mother Earth and her surroundings, access to treatment, and an end to prison crowding. We are a living wage and basic allowance, and we are waving signs and fists, not drowning. We are singing songs of praise and shouting. We are generations of resistance that cannot be put down. We extend beyond elections and whoever's in the White House. We have been to the top of the mountain, and we have survived from genocides to witch trials, and they could not burn us out or wipe us out or push us aside. We are femmes butches, trans, lesbians, women and woman identified. We are standing here with pride, and still we rise. Still we rise. Still we rise.
Oh, holy. Love leaving with that. You're fantastic. Love your brain. Thank you for sharing your view of the world.
Thank you, Leah. And I do want to say
It's
that
power.
I don't know if people, watch what you do and then want to get mad at you. But if anybody watches this conversation and you think, oh, I'm so upset that there was this kind of critique, I really urge you to really look into what is actually happening. Speak to guards, speak to people who work in the system. Remember, there's workers there that have to go in every day and deal with those conditions as well, and that say that they wish it would be different and they want to do their jobs differently as well. So you're very brave, I think, for holding this conversation and for allowing this witness and for speaking about this book, which is the voices of people who haven't even been able to read this book because it can't go into prison. So the people who shared their life can't even read this book. And that tells you everything perhaps you need to know about prison. So thank you for having this courage, Leah.
Oh, for sure. And thank you for writing this book.
Thank you. Thank you so much. You can
get
it from Fernwood Press and buy it at an independent bookstore. Try not to get it at Amazon.